We want to continue what we began last Sunday night with questions and answers. We had about 8 questions altogether and covered about half of those last Sunday night. So we wanted to pick up and move forward with several more of those and hopefully wrap all of this up this evening. Again, appreciate you turning in questions. They always are so very helpful and insightful, and I encourage you each time that we do this to turn some in. You can turn them in to me at any time that you wish. You can email it. You can send me a text message. I just ask that you put it in some kind of written form so that I will know exactly what you're asking, so I can answer exactly what you're asking rather than what I thought I remembered that you asked, and that will help me a great deal. But we will do this again before the year is over, Lord willing. So please turn one in if you would like to, and we'll look at that for next time. Before we actually get into Q&A, let me update you a little bit about some things that we discussed this afternoon in our elders meeting. We know that since our return to the building after the pandemic and our still trying to maintain our caution and so on, that for quite some time we have had, for lack of a better term, I guess, assigned seats. You know, we asked everybody to sit in the same place because there's so much, particularly early on, little understanding about exactly how the virus could be spread and so on. And after talking about it a little bit, we want to relax that just a little bit about the assigned seating. Some of you may like to sit in a different place than you have chosen for various reasons. It seems to be that, you know, when you think about it, we all pretty much sit in the same place every time anyway. We park in the same parking places. we do so many of the same things anyway. But we still want to be cautious about it. So here is our suggestion. If you like where you're sitting and you want to stay where you're sitting, you know, in that seat, then you stay there. And you can keep your name there if that's where you want to stay. And everybody will be very respectful of that. And nobody will take your seat or anything. But if you would like to sit in a different place, this is our suggestion for that. On Sunday morning, on Sundays, if you want to sit in a different place than where you normally do, sit in the same place every time on Sunday. In other words, Bible class, wherever you sit on Sunday morning for Bible class, stay there for the AM worship and the PM worship. Then we think, based on everything that we can learn from the CDC and so on, that by Wednesday, all the germs would be dead. So if you want to sit in a different place on Wednesday, you could sit in a different place. By the following Sunday, the germs should be dead again. So that would give you a little bit of leeway if you wanted to sit in a different place. You can pick a new place and stay there every time as far as we're concerned. But if you would like to change where you're sitting, we're going to make that concession and allow that. We think it can be done very safely. Just wherever you sit on Sunday, sit there every time on Sunday. And then you can change on Wednesday, you can change the following Sunday and so on. Just stay in the same place on the same day if you're here all 3 times on Sunday. And so not many of you may want to move or may move. That's fine too. Nobody's being forced to move or anything like that. But if you would like to, just stay in the same seat every time on Sunday, and then after that we should be clear by our next assembly as far as the germs passing away and so on. Even I think we would be pretty safe with Tuesday class meeting on Tuesday, 48 hours later almost from the time that anybody would be here on Sunday. Speaking of Tuesday class, this Tuesday is the opening day for our fall semester of Tuesday class. We will meet here in the auditorium, and we think we can keep our distancing at its maximum by doing that. And so our plan is to meet here in the auditorium, and we will pick up where we left off 6 months ago when we stopped meeting with our study of the survey of the life of Christ. And hopefully you'll be able to be at that. If you've not been part of Tuesday class before, let me encourage you to come and be with us, and we'll be studying about the life of Christ. As we continue now back into our Q&A, and we think about some questions that we have, let me come back and read one of the questions that we have answered part of last week regarding the time span of the 10 plagues. But there is actually a second question kind of involved in this one that I want to address, at least separately. But the question itself says, how much time elapsed from the first plague to the 10th? If you weren't here last Sunday, just in short, we don't know, but probably less than a year, very safe to say. Exodus 7, verse 25, gives 7 days between the first and second plague, but a time span is not given for the others, and very little is mentioned. It does say there are 3 days of darkness. It does tell us that there was one night of the death of the firstborn, but not a lot of other dates or days are given. Now here is the heart of the second question that's really kind of included in this one. Exodus 9, if you want to go ahead and turn to Exodus 9, it'd be very helpful. Exodus 9, that's about the 5th plague where the livestock died. Exodus 9, verse 6 says, all the Egyptian cattle died. By the time of the plague of hail, which is a little later in the same chapter, the 7th plague is the plague of hail. By the time of the plague of hail, there were livestock that were killed. In Exodus 9, verses 19 through 25. As well, when we get to the 10th plague, in Exodus 12, the firstborn of the cattle are killed during the 10th plague. And that is part of the question of the time frame of the plagues. And the last statement in this question says, the Egyptians must have gathered more livestock by then, implying that there must have been some, at least a reasonable span of time, whether it be a few days, few weeks, for them to gather up more livestock. And I think this is a good question as we think about the answers and the possibilities that exist here. First of all, let's look at Exodus chapter 9, and as we think about the 5th plague, in verse 3, God says, behold, the hand of the Lord will be on your cattle in the field, on the horses, on the donkeys, on the camels, on the oxen, on the sheep, a very severe pestilence. The Lord will make a difference between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so nothing will die of all that belongs to the children of Israel. And so he appointed a set time, and again, here's another reference to a little bit about a date, but tomorrow is when this thing will happen. Verse 6, so the Lord did this thing on the next day, and all the livestock of Egypt died, but the livestock of the children of Israel, not one died. As we look at that, it says that they all died, but when we move down in the chapter to verses 19 through 25, the plague of hail, it says that there's livestock that was killed then. And then when we get to the 10th plague, livestock, the firstborn of all the livestock, the firstborn of all the cattle, died then. And so was there a time frame there, a time span that elapsed of enough time for the Egyptians to be able to replace the livestock that died, because it says that all died? Well, I think there probably was some passage of time, but perhaps not an extensive passage of time. But let's understand this also from a couple of other perspectives. First of all, the usage in verse 6 of the word all. It says all the livestock died. Sometimes the word all is used in the Bible, and it is more of a figure of speech than it is a reference and meaning every single thing. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. Sometimes it may mean simply the greater part of, or it may mean all of a particular category. Keep that in mind, because I think what we're looking at here in Exodus 9 about the livestock dying is all of a particular category. And the answer to what that particular category is right here in the text. Just bear with me a moment. But the word all sometimes is used a little bit of a figure of speech and not in the absolute sense. For instance, in Exodus 7, it tells us after the Nile River turned to blood, that all the Egyptians, Exodus 7:24, all the Egyptians dug all around the river for water to drink. Obviously, when it says all the Egyptians, I don't think we would include babies, that we would include the very elderly or the disabled or people with complications that would prohibit them from engaging in that kind of activity. And so it's used in a relative sense there, meaning the greater part of. We also have to understand a passage in 2 Samuel 16, verse 22, where the word all is used. In 2 Samuel 16, verse 22, it says that Absalom, after he was rebelling against his father David, Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, does that literally mean that every single person in Israel saw that happen? I don't think that we could make that deduction from the term all right there, that it's in the absolute sense, but it's more in a general sense. It's more in meaning the greater part of. Not every single Israelite on the face of the earth saw or witnessed that thing happen, but his actions were so public that it was apparent to everyone as that was made known to everyone. Luke 15. In Luke 15, verse 1, it says, all the tax collectors and sinners drew near to Jesus. Now, do we really think that every single solitary tax collector that lived on the face of the earth and every single sinner that lived on the face of the earth was near Jesus? I think we understand that as not in the absolute sense, but it is more a figure of speech. It may mean the greater part of, or it may mean all of a particular category. When I was growing up, my mother had a little saying, and I think she still uses it from time to time, but my mother had a little saying when she went somewhere that was extremely crowded. And she would come back from that place that was extremely crowded, or maybe make the statement while we were there, and she would say, everybody and their brother was there. You probably heard that, and maybe somebody in your family has used it, but everybody and their brother was there. Was everybody there? No. Was everybody and their brother there? No. Were there a lot of people there? Sure. That's not used in the absolute sense, but it is more a figure of speech. And sometimes, I think from these at least three examples, we see that in the pages of the Bible. Maybe you have heard the expression used sometimes of a pivotal moment in an athletic competition where somebody says all eyes were upon him. Or maybe a singer on a stage in a competition, all eyes were upon her. Does that mean every single person in the arena was looking at that person? Were literally all eyes upon that individual? Well, of course, I think we understand that is not the case. This is a figure of speech that is used here, and it means all of a particular category. And the reason that I'm quite sure that it means all of a particular category, go back and read the text again in verse 3. Behold, the hand of the Lord will be on your cattle. Look at the next three words. In the field. Apparently, all of the cattle died that were where? In the field. Does that leave room for other cattle? It sure does. Ones that were in the barns, ones that were in the stalls, cattle that were not in the field. In fact, a little later on, when we look at that seventh plague about the hail, it tells us that the cattle died that were where? In the field. And so if there were cattle not in the field, we would assume that they're in a stall or a barn or a cave or some place that would shelter them. And what happened to those cattle? They survived. And apparently that, as we understand that about the plague of hail, we would understand that about this plague, the fifth plague, in the first part of chapter 9. That the cattle who were in the field, well, apparently they did die. but that doesn't mean that they all died. And so that's why the Egyptians had cattle later with the 9th plague and the 10th plague. But that also does not exclude the fact that the Egyptians could have purchased other cattle or confiscated them from the Hebrews, because we know what? None of their cattle died. And so all those are distinct possibilities, and they are certainly very possible explanations that very clearly would allow for this to be the case. Sometimes this particular section of Scripture about the all cattle and then cattle die here, well, I thought you said all died. Sometimes people look at this from the standpoint that the Bible is contradicting itself. Now, the person who asked this question did not ask it from that motivation. It is not asked with that kind of reason. It is not asked from that kind of motivation of saying the Bible is contradictory. It's simply asked in the framework of, well, what's a time frame for the length of the plagues? And incorporating that into it does give you some possibilities about maybe a little bit of time that would have existed, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a long time, because there was cattle not in the fields and not in the stalls. And so that would perhaps help us maybe understand that the plagues were not of an extreme duration as far as months and months and months and months, but this would allow for a shorter time frame to fit all those plagues into. But I wanted to come back and touch on that since it's asked in the question, and just point all that out, and that we can understand it hopefully a little more effectively in that way. Next question, again from the book of Exodus, says, was the death of the firstborn from males and females, or only males? Israel was to sacrifice firstborn males of the livestock and redeem the firstborn of their children as a sign to remember this event. Exodus 13, verses 11 through 16, as the children of Israel had been liberated from Egyptian bondage, they were to sacrifice the firstborn of all the livestock, and they were to redeem with money, a monetary unit, the firstborn of all the children, as a sign to remember this event. So if there is a remembrance of this and a redemption of this, a sacrifice of this, of the firstborn, would that not seem, I think the person is asking, does that not seem to indicate that the firstborn who died during the 10th plague perhaps were only males? I like a question that not only asks the question, but basically answers itself too. Because I think that does give us a great deal of the answer that most likely the death of the firstborn, probably of the cattle and the humans, was the male. There's no indication in the Scripture or the Scripture record of this event that the females died. Now, it could have happened, but all of the evidence seems to point very strongly toward death of the firstborn male. In fact, if you will turn back to before the plagues even started, to Exodus chapter 4, I think this may give us the answer better than anything else. Exodus chapter 4, as Moses is preparing to go back to Egypt and to do the bidding of God in delivering the children of Israel and leading them out of that bondage, you find this statement made by God in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 and 23. God says, "Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my," what? "Son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son, your firstborn." I think that probably more definitively answers the question than about anything else. Because the reference is made there to the male, is made to the son, and that I would conclude, based on that and based on the plague itself, I would conclude that the death of the firstborn would have been limited to the male of the livestock, the male of the Egyptian human population. Next question, Exodus 33. If you'll look at Exodus 33, there is an interesting reference here to something called the tent of meeting. In fact, the question says in Exodus 33, verses 12 through 16, the text refers to the tent of meeting. And here's the question. Is this where Moses went to judge the people in Exodus 18 before the tabernacle was built? And I think this is a good question. Now, you need to hold your finger there at Exodus 33 and Exodus 18, because both of these are going to come into play as we examine this question and hopefully arrive at what we think is a reasonable answer. In Exodus 18, it tells us that Moses had a responsibility for judging the people, and that the people would come to him and that he would judge them. And there's a little bit of background on this, if you will. Look at Exodus chapter 18. When we look at the first part of this chapter, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, has showed up while they're out here encamped in the wilderness. And he has brought the family to Moses. And he comes and he stays with Moses, apparently, at this particular time. In fact, as you read this, look at verse 7. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. And then there's a little bit of discussion of some things, and as you move a little further down in the text to verse 13, Exodus 18, verse 13, and so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. Is that a reference to the same tent from the question in Exodus 33? In Exodus 33, we read in verse 7 as well, Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and called it the tent of meeting, or some translations say the tabernacle of meeting. And it came to pass that everyone who sought the Lord went out to the tabernacle of meeting, which was outside the camp. So it was, whenever Moses went out to the tabernacle, that all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent door and watched Moses until he had gone into the tabernacle, the one he had pitched outside the camp, the tent of meeting. All the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle or tent door, and all the people rose and worshiped, each man in his tent door. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend, and he would return to the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle, did not depart from the tent of meeting. This reference in Exodus 33 is actually before the tabernacle itself that had the holy place and the most holy place in it built. But it is called a tabernacle here, which basically is the equivalent of our English word tent as well. A tent and a tabernacle in the Bible basically are the same thing. But the question, coming back, just to remind you, coming back to the question, is this reference in Exodus 33, the tent of meeting or tabernacle of meeting, is this where Moses went to judge the people in Exodus 18? Well, they could have been the same tent. But the circumstances of those two occasions, Exodus 18 and Exodus 33, appear to be very different. And it appears the location is also different. In Exodus 18, that tent is where Moses went in with his father-in-law and took his family. It appears to be Moses' personal dwelling. And it doesn't even say that he judged the people from that tent in Exodus 18. It could have been there, or it could have been another location. The location actually is not specified in regard to the judging. But I want you to notice in Exodus 18, it says that Moses and Jethro went into the tent after Jethro had brought the wife and kids. It appears to be Moses' personal dwelling. It is not directly stated this is where he did the judging that you read about a little later in the chapter. It is implied, possibly, but it could have been a different location. It appears to be a different tent in Exodus 33. Because in Exodus 33, as we have just read, Moses went back and forth to that tent. Apparently, he did not live in it. He went back and forth to that tent, and when he was not there, he left Joshua stationed there. This does not sound like his personal dwelling. This does not sound like his home. But was it the tent where he judged the people? Again, I am not absolutely certain that it is, because the circumstances, again, seem to be very different. In Exodus 18, the people were coming to be judged by Moses for various issues that they had while they were encamped before they entered into the Promised Land. In Exodus 33, if you read just prior to that, the children of Israel, while Moses was up on Mount Sinai, had committed a grievous sin of idolatry. And the covenant was in complete jeopardy. And there was a possibility that God, in His wrath and justice, could have completely hit the grand restart button. Moses set this tent of meeting up in Exodus 33, separate from the camp, separate from the people, separate from where this sinful activity had happened. It was there to magnify or to remind Israel of the great jeopardy they were in. And Moses went there to communicate with God, and God came down to that tent outside the camp. Not as He would later when the tabernacle was in the middle of the camp. Exodus 18 verse 15 says the people came to inquire of God about laws and rules and judgments. Whereas Exodus 33 verse 7 says everyone who sought the Lord came to that tent. I don't know if I can make it a huge difference between the people inquiring in God or the people who sought God, but there seems to be a difference. Because in Exodus 18, the people are wanting to know something from God. But in Exodus 33, the people are wanting to give of themselves to God. In Exodus 18, they are seeking something from God. In Exodus 33, they are seeking God. Because there is a distinct possibility that God was going to reject them, abandon them, and cut them off. And it seems the purposes of the two instances, the purposes of the two chapters, one where Moses judged and one where Moses went to the tabernacle or tent of meeting, it seems the purposes are distinctly different. But again, that does not exclude that they could have been in the same location, but it does not seem to be that they were. Particularly, the text does not state where Moses judged the people. Was it his personal tent? It doesn't say. Was it another location? It doesn't say. It simply says that he judged the people, and that they came to him. That very well could have been at his personal dwelling. But Exodus 33, that tent does not seem to be his personal dwelling. So if he did judge the people at his personal dwelling, I think Exodus 33 is not where the people went for judging. not where they went to hear something from God. This is where they went when they sought God. There may be more leeway and more room for discussion. I may not cover everything about that, but it does seem that these two locations are not only different from where they are, in relation to the camp, but in relation to everything that happened at them and everything about them. And so I would say, in my judgment, that these would be different tents for different purposes. Now, another question from Exodus, and this is question number 3 for the evening. Really, I guess it's question number 4 for the evening. And this relates to something in Exodus chapter 19. If you would, look at Exodus 19. This is when Israel is out the base of Mount Sinai. God has come down to the mountain. He's preparing to come down, and Moses is preparing to go up. And in Exodus 19, if you would, look at verse 22 through 24. In Exodus 19, verse 22, God says, "Also, let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it. Then the Lord said to him, away, get down, and then come up, you and Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through or come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them." The question is, did Israel have people designated as priests before the law was given on Sinai? I have read this text I don't know how many times in my life. I have preached sermons from Exodus chapter 19. And it was not until really I got this question and I began reading this text that I realized it mentions priests before the law was even given. A fascinating question. And it shows how many times we can read the same thing and think that we've got it pretty good in our mind, and yet there's something there that we've missed. Priests are known in the history of God's people and the history of man prior to the law of Moses. You may recall when we look back in the book of Genesis that Abraham gave tithes to a man named Melchizedek, who is called the priest of the Most High God. And when Joseph was in Egypt near the end of the book of Genesis, the Bible there talks about priests that are mentioned even in Egypt. In fact, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, whom we have already referred to, is also known as a priest. And so there were priests prior to the law of Moses. In fact, when we look at Exodus chapter 12, we have to remember that we are still prior to the law of Moses, which would put us in what we have often called the patriarchal age. And during the patriarchal age, the patriarch of the family, the head of the family, basically functioned as the priest for the people of his family. And you may recall that even Job, who might have lived during the patriarchal age, offered sacrifices for his children. Did not go to a priest, but did it himself, which seems to indicate that patriarchal time frame that maybe he lived and functioned in. So, that still causes us to ask the question, who are these guys? Who is being referred to here? Well, you probably have two possibilities. It could be the patriarchs of the families, the firstborn that had been consecrated. And when we look back a little earlier in this, and we've already referred to this as well, when God says, all the firstborn are mine, Exodus 13, the firstborn are mine, he consecrated them. It could be a reference to them. It could be a reference to the patriarchs, or it could be a reference to the priests designate prior to them being priests, the sons of Aaron. Because look back at our text, and when we read it again, in verse 24, it says, "Get down and then come up, you and Aaron with you." And we know eventually Aaron and his sons would be consecrated as priests, but not yet. In fact, we don't read of that until Exodus chapter 28. In Exodus 28, we read about Aaron and his sons being designated as priests, but maybe they were priests designate at this point, although that may not be the case as well. Don't want to make too much of that. They would be, Aaron and his sons would be consecrated in Exodus 28 and 29. But there's something also interesting when you go back to Exodus 19. And like I said, I have looked over the fact that it mentions priests in verse 22 and 24, but I have noticed and I have preached verse 6. And in verse 6, when God is telling Israel that He has lifted them up on eagle's wings and how special a people they are and how much He is going to bless them, He calls them, among other things, what? A kingdom of what? Priests. And so there is a reference to the fact that all Israel would be in some way recognized as a kingdom of priests. And when we move into the pages of the New Testament, although this may be a little out of the scope of the question, but when we move into the pages of the New Testament, Peter calls New Testament Christians what? A royal priesthood. So we see that God's people can be referred to as priests even before the law of Moses was in effect and after the law of Moses had been voided. And so this may not thoroughly answer the question, but it would appear that there were people even prior to the law of Moses and the priestly order of Aaron and his sons being officially designated. It would appear that there were individuals who served in that function under the patriarchal age. And that's not something that is uncommon or shouldn't be unfamiliar to us or unknown to us. And perhaps these men that are the priests who are referred to here are of that nature. Let me tell you one other passage, if you would turn a couple of pages over to Exodus 24. And in Exodus 24, you read about something pretty interesting as well that probably has a little bearing on this. In Exodus 24, verse 1, God said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar." Well, Aaron, who would be the high priest, Nadab and Abihu, his sons, they would die before they fulfilled much of their life ministry, but they were priests. Well, you keep reading down and look at verse 4 and 5. Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose up early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. Well, it doesn't call them priests there, but they were involved in sacrifice. And Moses, being the leader of the people, would have the authority to designate someone to do this. Perhaps that is somewhat what's going on over in Exodus chapter 19. But I think there's something that we forget sometimes about Moses as well. He was from what tribe? Levi, the priestly tribe. And so in that sense, he would have had a very close connection with the fulfillment about a priesthood as well. Again, I don't know if this satisfactorily answers the question of who these people were, but obviously there were people who were functioning in this role, just like there were elders of the people, that's mentioned in chapter 24, verse 1, who had leadership and responsibilities. We don't know every detail about them either, but they did have a function and they did fulfill that, and we don't have to know every single detail about that to understand that it did happen. And again, I don't feel like I'm answering that question as adequately or as the best that it could be answered, but hopefully that answer does give some insight to it. Final question for the evening. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record time according to Jewish time, such as the 6th hour means noon, etc. John, in his gospel, seems to be using Roman time. The person asked the question says, according to side notes in the Bible, John 19:14. We'll look at that passage in a moment. 6 hour, instead of being noon, is 6 a.m. according to Roman time. The question is this true, and does there seem to be a reason to be different? And it does appear to be the case. Is this true? It does appear to be the case from John's gospel that he uses Roman time, Roman civil time, rather than Jewish time, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke use what we would call Jewish time. What does that mean? Well, the Jews and the Romans had different standards for counting for time, but both of them split the day into two 12-hour parts, much like we do today. In fact, basically, we use Roman time today. For the Romans, a new day began at midnight, like it does for us. For the Jews, a new day began at sundown, or at evening, what you and I would refer to as 6 p.m. And it appears that Matthew, Mark, and Luke used that type of accounting of time, whereas John used the Roman time. Well, why would he do that? Why would John shift gears like that, having grown up as a Jew? Well, we have to remember a couple of things. Most of the indication is that John probably wrote his gospel much later than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that he was writing more with the Greek Hellenistic people in mind than so much the Jewish people in mind. And with that being the case, he would have written using the standard of time with which those people would have been far more familiar. In fact, if he wrote after the fall of Jerusalem, which there is some speculation, some scholars indicate that maybe he did, but if he did indeed write after the fall of Jerusalem, and some would even say that he wrote near the end of the first century, perhaps some 20 plus years after the fall of Jerusalem, Jewish time would have not been in vogue almost anywhere by anyone. And he would have used more of the standard of time with which his audience would have been very familiar. Let me tell you where this comes into play most significantly. And that is from those who would say that, again, based on these different usages and because there's a lack of understanding of that there's a contradiction between John and Mark because they refer to different times in regard to the crucifixion of Jesus. In fact, if you will look in your Bibles and we begin reading and we look at John and we look at Mark, we see exactly what is meant there. Mark records that the Lord was crucified in Mark 15, verse 25. Mark 15, 25. Mark records that the Lord was crucified at the 3rd hour, using Jewish time, that is 9 a.m. in the morning. John records that Jesus was before Pilate at the 6th hour, which if you use Jewish time, that would be noon. So is John right if he's using Jewish time that Jesus was crucified at noon? Or is Mark right using Jewish time when he says Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m.? Or, to even further complicate it a little bit, is Mark right using Jewish time saying Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m.? Or is John right saying Jesus was crucified using Roman time at the 6th hour, which would be 6 a.m.? Either way you look at it, it seems that John and Mark don't agree, that they don't sync up with one another. Well, I think we have to understand a couple of things here. Let's look at the passages again. Look at the context of John's allusion to the 6th hour. in John 19, verse 13 and following, Pilate therefore, John 19, verse 13, Pilate therefore heard the saying. He brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus and led him away. If John is using Roman time and the 6th hour, that would be 6 a.m. But look at what Mark says. In Mark's Gospel, in Mark chapter 15, beginning at verse 21, Then they compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, this is Mark 15, verse 21, They compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by to bear his cross. And they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. There they gave him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it. And when they crucified him, they divided his garments, casting lots for them to determine what every man should take. Now it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him. If Mark is using Jewish time, which seems to be the case, there's very little debate about that, that would be 9 a.m. If John is using Roman time, which there's not a lot of debate about that either, and he says 6 hour, that would be 6 a.m. So was Jesus crucified at 6 a.m. or 9 a.m.? This is where it comes into play. And that, I know I'm kind of going beyond the bounds of the question, because the person who turned this question in did not ask all this, but I'm bringing it to the table since we're on this discussion because it's very important. You may run into somebody who might bring up this very point, and we need to be able to effectively answer it. Again, if you will, go back to John 19, and in John 19, it says that they brought Jesus out to the judgment seat, to the pavement. It was about the 6th hour. Pilate said, Behold your king. The people said, Crucify him. Pilate said, Till I crucify your king. The chief priest said, No king but Caesar. He delivered him to them to be crucified. Now that text does not say that they were at Golgotha at that moment. That text does not say that he was crucified at that moment, but they led him away. What else was going to happen before Jesus was actually nailed to the cross? He would be beaten, and he would have to make that journey from where he was beaten to the location outside the city to the site of the crucifixion. This was not a short journey for a man who had been beaten half to death. And we also have to account in here for the time that transpired between the discussion with Pilate and the chief priest, and Pilate finally acquiescing and saying, Very well, take him on. Apparently, those proceedings, not the actual crucifixion, but apparently those proceedings started at 6 a.m. And you know what? John even says that they started early. If you look back in your gospel in Mark chapter 15, it says that it was in the morning. But if you look back at John 18, verse 28, in John 18, verse 28, it tells us that when Jesus and his prosecutors wanted the audience with Pilate, look at John 18, 28. What time was it? Well, it's not specified by an hour, but it has told us that it is what? Early morning. If the choice is between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m., which one is early morning? Obviously, 6 a.m. 6 a.m. is early morning. You see, the critic has to prove that it couldn't have happened that way. John tells us that it was early morning when Jesus was delivered over at Gabbatha, at the pavement. Then Mark tells us it was the third hour of the day using Jewish time. John tells us all that using Roman time. And Mark tells us using Jewish time that it was the third hour, 9 a.m., when Jesus was at Golgotha. And there he was crucified. 6 a.m., Roman time, Gabbatha, the pavement. 9 a.m., Jewish time, Golgotha. 6 a.m., Roman time, John, the proceedings began. 9 a.m., Mark's gospel, Jewish time, the crucifixion was consummated. And we can easily account for the 3 hours between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. for all the things that took place that happened to Jesus before they actually nailed him to the cross. There is no contradiction. Yes, there is a use of different time. One is Jewish time and one is Roman time. But there is no contradiction here. In fact, these accounts harmonize very well together. And again, the person who had turned in the question that was turned in was not asked from the standpoint of, is this a contradiction? And I have developed that a little further than the intent of the question, but I wanted to do that because you and I might run into opposition or something brought up about a contradiction in the Word of God. I just want you to know that even though different times are used, there is no contradiction in the Word of God about when Jesus was crucified. And so as we think about that being our final question, and we think about when Jesus was crucified, that he died for each and every one of us, we are touched with the great love of God through his Son Jesus, who was willing to die on our behalf. And so we extend the invitation of the one who died for us, to die for him, to die to sin, to be buried in the waters of baptism, and to rise again to walk in newness of life. If you are ready and willing to respond to the invitation, would you come this evening as we stand